What if the Antichrist isn't coming in the future because he's already here? What if he doesn't wear horns, doesn't carry a pitchfork, doesn't rise with thunder from the abyss, but instead wears a suit, preaches from pulpits, runs governments, and lives inside your screen? The Western Church told us to look for a beast, for a false Messiah, for a global deceiver in the last days. But in the mountains of Ethiopia, among ancient churches carved straight into stone and monks who chant prayers older than the Roman Empire, a very different warning has been preserved. One that says, the Antichrist is not coming, the Antichrist has already come. And worse, we welcomed him. You see, Ethiopia never lost the books that the West removed. Books like Enoch, Jubilees, the Apocalypse of Peter. Books that speak of cosmic rebellion, fallen angels, divine knowledge, and a deceiver not of the future, but of the present. A deceiver who doesn't just fight the truth, but edits it. Who doesn't burn holy texts, but rewrites them. And what if the greatest lie wasn't told by the serpent, but by the scribe? In this video, we will take you deep into Ethiopia's forbidden prophecies, the ones Western theologians call apocrypha, but that Ethiopian monks call memory. We'll reveal how these ancient warnings describe the Antichrist not as a man, but as a system, one that corrupts empires, hijacks religion, rewires morality, and sells control disguised as freedom. And in Part 6, we'll uncover the prophecy hidden in the Ethiopian Book of Revelation, Medafkatus, that reveals how the Antichrist operates not outside the church, but within it. So don't skip, don't blink, because what's at stake here is your perception of truth itself. If you believe Scripture has been edited, hit the like button. Comment below. Truth is the sword. Subscribe to uncover what the canon erased and what Ethiopia never forgot.
In the highlands of East Africa, where morning mist still clings to the ancient stones, there are churches not built, but carved straight into the mountain. These are not ruins of a forgotten past. They are living sanctuaries. In Ethiopia, faith is not just belief, it's blood memory, it's breath, it's scripture sung out loud in a language older than Latin, older than Greek, written in Ge'ez, a script that carries the sounds of prayers no Western Bible ever held. Here, the Bible was never edited. While the Western world debated which books to keep and which ones to burn, at councils convened by emperors, not prophets, Ethiopia quietly held on to everything. Theirs is the most complete biblical canon on earth, 81 books, not 66. They kept the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Book of the Covenant, and more. Books that speak of angels who fell, secrets sealed by heaven, and warnings about a war not of swords, but of spirits. Why does that matter? Because the story changes depending on who's allowed to tell it. In the West, Enoch was erased, but in Ethiopia, Enoch is not legend, he is scripture. And his writings speak of watchers from the heavens, of forbidden knowledge, of a celestial rebellion that forever altered humanity's path. While Rome buried these truths, Ethiopia remembered. And not just through books, through chant, through ritual, through generation after generation of priests who never forgot the stories whispered by their ancestors. Even today, deep in the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela or the island monasteries of Lake Tana, monks sit by candlelight, copying ancient manuscripts by hand. No machines, no internet, just ink, parchment, and memory. And it is from these texts that a different version of Christianity emerges, one that didn't pass through Rome, one untouched by European conquest. A Christianity where Christ is not a tool of empire, but a mirror of the divine spark in all people, where salvation isn't bought by dogma, but revealed through revelation. So what happens when we read the Bible not through Rome's eyes, but through Ethiopia's memory? We begin to see things differently. We begin to ask, why were these books removed? What truth were they hiding? And who decided that truth didn't belong to us? But even more important than the books themselves is what they reveal about a much older question, one that begins not at the cross, but in a garden. And that's where we're going next.
For most of us raised in the West, the story is simple. There was a garden, there was a woman, there was a serpent, and there was a lie. We're taught that this serpent was Satan in disguise, that he tricked Eve into eating the forbidden fruit, that this was the first sin, the moment humanity fell, the reason we needed saving in the first place. But what if that's not the whole story? In Ethiopia, there's another version, one that doesn't contradict the Bible, but reads it differently, not through fear, but through awakening. Let's go back to the garden, not with Western eyes, but with Ethiopian memory. The serpent speaks to Eve and says, God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Now here's what's remarkable. When Eve eats, that's exactly what happens. In Genesis 3:22, God himself says, Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. The serpent didn't lie. He told the truth, and the result wasn't death, it was awareness. Ethiopian mystics see this not as original sin, but as original awakening, a moment when humanity stepped out of innocence and into divine consciousness, when Adam and Eve didn't fall, but woke up, not in rebellion against God, but in a deeper alignment with what it means to be made in His image. Of course, awakening comes with cost. Awareness brings responsibility. Freedom demands consequence. That's why they were cast out, not to be punished, but to walk a path that only conscious beings can walk. It's a radically different way of seeing the story, not as a fall from grace, but a rise into knowledge. And that changes everything. Because if we weren't damned from the beginning, then maybe we weren't saved by guilt. Maybe we were always meant to evolve, to know, to choose. And maybe the real danger was never the serpent. Maybe the real danger was the rewriting of the serpent's story. Because in that rewriting, knowledge became sin, curiosity became rebellion, and awakening became a crime. So what happens when a religion is built not on the pursuit of truth, but on the fear of it? That's when we begin to lose sight of who the real deceiver is. And this is where the Ethiopian texts become even more unsettling. Because if the serpent wasn't the villain, then who was? And if humanity's first awakening was forbidden, then what does that say about the powers who forbade it? This brings us face to face with a truth few dare to consider. The Antichrist didn't wait for the end times. According to Ethiopia, he's already here.
We've been taught to fear a man who's coming, a man who will deceive the world, claim to be the Messiah, unite nations under false peace, and plunge the world into darkness. A man who will rise in the end times and call himself God. But Ethiopia tells a different story. In the texts preserved by Ethiopian monks, especially in the Meat Ketis, their version of Revelation, the Antichrist isn't a man waiting at the edge of history. He's not some theatrical villain on the world stage. No, the Antichrist is a spirit, a system, and according to them, he's already here. He doesn't preach from a throne. He preaches from your screen. He doesn't wear horns. He wears the mask of progress. He doesn't carry a sword. He carries a slogan. And worst of all, he looks like the Messiah, but speaks like a dragon. That phrase, looks like the Messiah but speaks like a dragon, comes straight from Ethiopia's revelation, and it's been interpreted as a warning, not of a coming dictator, but of a deceiver that hides in plain sight, one that disguises itself in democracy, in technology, in freedom, but serves only one master, Mammon. Because that's how the Antichrist works. He rides on the back of systems we already trust. He baptizes greed and calls it blessing. He wraps control in convenience, and he replaces wisdom with endless noise. Think about it. We wake up to screens. We fall asleep to them. We measure our worth by numbers, likes, follows, views. Our attention is sold to the highest bidder. Our beliefs are shaped by algorithms. And our rest is disturbed by the constant demand to produce, consume, compete. And somehow, we call this freedom. But the Ethiopian texts say otherwise. They say the Antichrist is a spirit that entered the world long ago, one that crawled into our systems, economic, political, even religious, and dressed itself in light. It promises salvation through empire, peace through power, truth through censorship. It builds cathedrals made of steel and glass, but never opens the heart. And the most terrifying part, we worship it, not with hymns, but with habits, not with altars, but with attention, not with offerings, but with obedience. In the West, we're still waiting for the Antichrist. In Ethiopia, they've been watching him work for centuries. Because to them, the Antichrist isn't coming, he's winning. And the church? He's there too. In pulpits that teach prosperity over humility, in leaders who bless war and call it holy, in sermons that silence dissent instead of revealing truth. So then the question becomes, if the Antichrist wears the face of religion, how would you know it was him? That's where we're going next, because Ethiopia's most haunting prophecy isn't that the Antichrist rules the world, it's that he's ruling the church.
If the Antichrist hides inside the church, then we have to ask a hard question. When did the gospel become a weapon? Because there was a time, long ago, when Christ walked among the poor, the broken, the outcast. His power was in his gentleness. His truth came without armies. His kingdom was not of this world. But centuries later, that same gospel would march with soldiers, preach beside emperors, and justify empires. And according to Ethiopia, that wasn't an accident. It was the fulfillment of a prophecy. Let's go back to the 4th century. In 325 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. It was the moment when Christianity stopped being persecuted and started being institutionalized. The cross moved from the hands of martyrs into the hands of monarchs. But something else happened too. Books were removed. Voices were silenced. Anything that didn't align with the empire's vision of Christ was declared heresy. Gone were texts like the Book of Enoch, Jubilees, and the Testament of Solomon, books that warned of corruption, of angelic rebellion, of spiritual warfare beyond human politics. And while Rome edited the story, Ethiopia held on to it. They kept the full canon. They remembered what Constantine tried to erase, and in doing so, they preserved a version of Christianity untouched by empire. Now fast forward 1,000 years. European powers sailed to Africa, not as pilgrims, but as conquerors. They bring the Bible in one hand and a sword in the other. They preach salvation, but demand submission. And everywhere they go, they destroy what came before
ancestral belief systems, sacred lands, spiritual traditions older than the Church of Rome itself. But Ethiopia? Ethiopia stood apart. They were never colonized in the way others were, and their monks saw what was happening. They wrote that the beast from the sea had returned, not as a monster, but as a missionary, not to bring the gospel, but to replace it. And maybe that's the darkest irony of all. The Antichrist didn't burn churches. He built them. He didn't destroy the gospel. He rewrote it. He didn't kill Christ. He used his name to conquer nations. Because when a gospel is stripped of compassion, when it baptizes greed, when it blesses kings but silences prophets, it no longer belongs to Jesus. It belongs to the dragon. And the Ethiopian texts knew this. They warned of false shepherds, leaders who would rise from within the church, not to feed the flock, but to feed themselves, to elevate their nations as divine, to persecute truth speakers, to replace revelation with control. So the next time someone asks, how could the Antichrist deceive so many? The answer might be, he used the gospel to do it. And now, as we look at the world around us, its politics, its preachers, its prophets for profit, we have to ask, is the Christ we're following the real one? Because the Ethiopian Bible doesn't just warn us of a false Christ out there. It warns us of the one we've already accepted. And that leads us to the final battle. Not a war of tanks or bombs, but a war of the soul, a war of perception, of thought, of consciousness. And that is where we're headed next.
We often imagine the end of the world with fire, mushroom clouds, explosions, armies clashing beneath a blood-red sky. But Ethiopia's ancient prophecies say otherwise. The final war, they warn, will not be fought with weapons. It will not be televised. It will happen quietly, inside your mind, because the battlefield is consciousness. This war doesn't begin with soldiers. It begins with thoughts, with perception, with truth, twisted just enough to feel familiar until you no longer know what's real and what's been manufactured. And that's exactly how the Antichrist wins. You see, he doesn't need to conquer you by force. He just needs to keep you asleep, distracted, divided. He doesn't silence the truth. He floods it with noise. Look around. We live in a world where information is endless, but wisdom is scarce, where we scroll past suffering and call it news, where ancient truths are labeled conspiracy and shallow distractions are labeled truth. The Ethiopian texts speak of this age as a spiritual fog, a time when people will have eyes but not see, ears but not hear, hearts but not feel. In their vision, the Antichrist's greatest weapon isn't war, it's confusion. Not fire from heaven, but comfort. Not violence, but seduction. He doesn't break you. He entertains you. He distracts you. He lulls you into thinking everything's fine while stealing your soul, one scroll, one click, one compromise at a time. And in this war, silence is surrender. That's why the Ethiopian tradition urges awakening, not through revolt, but through revelation. To question what we've been told, to seek the books that were removed, to trace truth back to its source, not through empire, but through memory. Because once your mind is free, the system can't hold you. And it's here that the serpent returns, not as a villain, but as a symbol. The same serpent that Western theology cast as evil, Ethiopia sometimes sees as the bearer of forbidden knowledge, the catalyst of awakening, the whisper that said, "Open your eyes." That's the great inversion. Where Western religion says knowledge is dangerous, Ethiopia says knowledge is divine. Because in this war, truth is the sword. Not doctrine, not dogma, not tradition. Truth, unfiltered, uncomfortable, and ancient. And the ones that carry it? They're not generals. They're not priests in cathedrals. They're people like you, searching, doubting, waking up. The final war is already here. It's in the choices you make when no one's watching. It's in the voices you trust, the stories you believe, the parts of you that still long for truth, even when it costs you everything. Because once you awaken, you can't go back to sleep. And when enough people awaken, that's when the spell breaks. That's when the kingdom of the deceiver begins to crumble, not with violence, but with vision. And that vision leads us to the most dangerous truth of all. Not just who the serpent was, not just who the Antichrist is, but who rewrote the story and why.
If the final war is for your mind, then the sharpest weapon ever forged isn't a gun, or a crown, or even a cross. It's a pen. Because whoever writes the story controls the world. And now we must ask a question far more dangerous than who is the Antichrist. We must ask who rewrote our God. It's a question Ethiopia has carried for centuries. You see, while the Western world canonized its version of the Bible, edited, trimmed, curated to serve empire, Ethiopia kept the memory alive. Not because they wanted to be different, but because they remembered what was removed. Books like Enoch, that warned of angelic rebellions and divine knowledge. Books like Jubilees, that traced the sacred calendar and time itself. The Testament of Solomon, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Book of the Covenant. They weren't myths, they were testimonies. But someone decided you didn't need to read them. And in doing so, the scribe became more powerful than the prophet. Because if you can edit Genesis, if you can turn an awakening into a sin, if you can change the serpent into a devil, and the Antichrist into someone who hasn't even come yet, then you can rewrite the map of salvation itself. You can turn a liberator into a villain, turn knowledge into heresy, turn spiritual revolution into religious obedience. And that's what happened. The serpent was never the real enemy. The real deception was in who got to tell the story. Ethiopian mystics have long warned of this inversion, that the world would call good evil and evil good, that the true threat to humanity wouldn't come from rebellion, but from editing, from scribes who served kings instead of truth. So here's the truth. The most dangerous serpent isn't the one in the garden. It's the one holding the pen at the edge of empire. Because when you control the scripture, you don't need to conquer the people. You just rewrite what they believe. And over time, truth becomes myth. Myth becomes heresy. And heresy becomes history. That's why Ethiopia matters. Because it didn't forget. Because hidden in its mountains, its chants, its manuscripts, there's still a version of Christianity that remembers who we were before the edits, before empire, before control, before the fall was called a curse. A Christianity where Christ doesn't serve Caesar, where prophets don't work for kings, where revelation still burns like fire, dangerous, untamed, alive. So maybe we were never deceived by the serpent. Maybe we were deceived by the scribe. And now the choice is yours. Will you keep reading the version handed to you by empire? Or will you go looking for the version they tried to bury? The version preserved not in Rome, but in Ethiopia. Because this isn't just about religion, it's about history, and who has the right to tell it.